I'm lost. No, not really. But my sermon is about being lost. It was probably about this time of year when Jesus knew his time of physical ministry on the earth was coming to an end, and that soon he was going to have to start looking south to Jerusalem and travel down to Judah from the nation of Israel up by the Sea of Galilee. And for 3 years he'd been hounded and harassed by the Pharisees, and yet still, even this close to the end, he was trying to get them to see who he really was. That he was the Messiah. He was the one that they had been preparing for all of these centuries. And after speaking in the synagogue one Sabbath, just like Nazarenes after the service, a Pharisee invited the special speaker home for dinner. So he goes to the house of a Pharisee to dine with him, with undoubtedly a bunch of other Pharisees that were there to hear him speak. And so he goes to his house, and he sits down to eat, and this crippled servant comes walking by. Jesus heals him. And he's immediately pounced upon by the Pharisees. How can you heal a man on the Sabbath? That's work. We're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And he gives it back to him. And he tells them a couple parables. There's a wedding feast, and there's a banquet. And if you're familiar with those, the rich man invites all these people, to these two separate events. Nobody shows up that were invited, so they've got to go out in the streets and bring in the commoners to dine at the banquet, to sit at the table of the wedding feast. Now, Luke doesn't tell us who in that house, in that Pharisee's house, understood the parables that Jesus just told. But I have a feeling the Pharisees weren't too excited about them. But someone was stirred by those parables. Because at the end of chapter 14 of Luke and at the beginning of 15, now Jesus is being followed through the city by a great crowd of people. So somebody in that house had to have gone outside to begin to spread the word that Jesus healed a man and told some great parables in his house. Because now everybody was coming to hear. Luke tells us that the worst of the worst in the city had made their way through the crowd, and they were the ones that was closest to Jesus. The tax collectors, the sinners, they made it to the front of the crowd. So very possibly it was the servant who was healed who went out into the streets after the dinner and began to tell his friends, "Hey, look, I'm healed. Jesus healed me. And he's about to come out. So if you want your chance, you better come now." So Jesus left the house of the Pharisee and was walking through town followed by this great crowd. And here he was explaining with his actions the parables that he had just told in the house of the Pharisee. He had invited his Pharisees to this great party in heaven, but they didn't want to have anything to do with him. So now he was going out into the streets and inviting the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. So now, here's Jesus with this crowd of people. The sinners, the worst of the sinners, and the tax collectors, right up against him. And he knows the Pharisees can see it all. Because Luke tells us the Pharisees saw it all. So Jesus is probably just down the street from that Pharisee's house, and as soon as he walked out the door, they all go up to the roof and look down into the streets to see what's going on. And if there were any smart Pharisees in that group, they realized that they had just been uninvited from the wedding feast and the banquet. And so Jesus begins to talk to these societal castaways. He has to convince them that they are now invited to a great banquet, to a huge wedding feast. But more importantly, he has to convince them to accept the invitation. You see, anybody can be invited anywhere. But for someone that's been told most of their life, if not all of their lives, that they're worthless, no good, unwanted, getting them to believe that they'll be treated with kindness and respect at a lavish banquet would be near impossible. But Jesus knew those to whom he was speaking. He looked around him in each of their eyes, and he knew their names. He knew their stories. And he knew how to reach them. He looked at them and saw people who had grown up studying the Torah like every good Jewish boy. Maybe they'd tried to study under a rabbi and didn't quite make the cut. Maybe they'd gone to the synagogue with their father all their lives, but somewhere along the way as they reached adulthood, they got distracted with life. Maybe they started to have to work longer hours to support their family, and, they just didn't have time to go to synagogue anymore. Maybe their friends got them interested in some hobbies that took their time away from when they would normally go to synagogue on the Sabbath. But whatever the reason, they weren't spending time with their God like they used to. He looked at them, and he saw people that had not actually grown up in a Jewish household. They were slaves. They were foreign servants, travelers, vagrants. They didn't know anything substantial about God, only what they picked up in conversation or maybe what was required of them if they worked in a Jewish household. If they knew about any gods at all, it certainly wasn't one who had known them from conception and knew the number of hairs on their head. They had no idea that God loved them because no one had taken the time to tell them. He looked at them and saw people who knew the teachings of Moses inside and out. They could quote forwards and backwards the prophets. But they were tired of the straight and narrow. They wanted the excitement that they saw other people having. God wasn't striking those people with bolts of lightning because of disobedience. They had lived righteousness for long enough, and it was Miller time, literally. These people were living, or had lived, one big party, and most of them couldn't or didn't want to remember what they did last night. Those are the people Jesus looked at when he spoke these words.